Seattle General in Norfolk smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that buzz like insects trapped in plastic. Brooke Sullivan moves through the ICU with invisible efficiency, her scrubs pressed to knife-edge precision, her movements economical and practiced. 3 years of civilian nursing have taught her how to disappear. 3 years of being someone else, of pushing down the muscle memory, of keeping her hand steady while her mind stays blank. She checks for lines in room 404 where Garrett lies with bandages covering the space where his eyes used to be. Former Ranger. Lost his vision to an IED outside Kandahar 6 weeks ago. The chart says he's stable. The chart doesn't say he's broken. When she changes his dressings, her hands don't shake. Unusual for a civilian nurse working combat injuries. She's gentle, careful with the gauze, careful with the saline rinse, but there's a precision to it that comes from somewhere deeper than nursing school. From somewhere the Pentagon buried. She reaches for the folded flag on the bedside table, the one with the unit patch she'd quietly placed there yesterday morning. Her fingers linger on the fabric for half a second. Just half a second. Long enough to remember. Long enough to hurt. She sets it back down and moves on. "How are you feeling today, Garrett?" Her voice is soft, deferential. A civilian voice. Safe. Like I'm missing the most important thing a ranger needs. He doesn't look at her, can't look at her, but his jaw tightens. How much longer? Doctor says the nerve damage assessment takes time. 4 to 6 weeks before we know what's permanent. She adjusts the fall line with the precision of someone who's done this in sandstorms with mortar rounds landing 50 yards out, though nobody here would know that. "You're healing well." That matters. He doesn't respond. Just turns his ruined face toward the window where he can't see the parking lot anyway. The afternoon runs quiet. The kind of quiet that lets your thoughts run too loud. Brooke finishes her shift rounds by 4 p.m. and heads to the supply office on the basement level where the fluorescent lights buzz even louder and the air smells like plastic packaging and something chemical underneath. The inventory audit is routine. She's been running them for 18 months without issue. Count what's listed. Match it to what's actually on the shelves. Find the discrepancies. File the report. Except today there's a discrepancy that doesn't make sense. The ventilator count shows 18 units billed to insurance over the past 2 months. New hospital stock. Top-tier equipment with the kind of price tags that justify the paperwork. But when Brooke walks the aisles, she counts 12 units on the shelves. She recounts. 12 again. Her hands move through the inventory system on the old desktop computer, pulling purchase orders and billing receipts. The numbers don't align. Never align like this. 18 billed. 12 in stock. 6 units that exist only on paper. She's running the numbers a third time when Dr. Richard Mercer appears in the doorway. He's a tall man with the kind of face that announces wealth, sharp cheekbones, tailored blazer, a wedding band that probably cost more than Brooke's car. His smile is practiced. Warm. The kind of smile that makes people want to trust him. Brooke. Running inventory. He steps inside and closes the door behind him. The sound of the latch is very clear in the quiet basement. Supply audit. Monthly reconciliation. She keeps her voice level. Professional. She doesn't stand up, keeps herself at the desk, smaller, less confrontational. The disappeared version of herself. I found a discrepancy in the ventilator billing. His smile doesn't change, but something else does. Something in his eyes goes flat and cold, like looking into the windows of an empty house. He walks closer to the desk. Stands beside her. Close enough that she can smell his cologne, something expensive that probably has a French name. A discrepancy. Not a question. An observation. 18 units on the billing statements from the past 2 months. She points to the screen. Her finger is steady. 12 in actual inventory. 6 units appear on purchase orders and insurance claims, but I can't locate them. He leans down. Studies the screen the way a doctor studies an X-ray. His breathing is even. His hands are relaxed. But that cold thing in his eyes is still there, and it's getting colder. Inventory control software isn't always accurate, he says quietly. Equipment moves between departments. Gets rerouted. The system lags. The system shows last movement 3 weeks ago. She points to the timestamp. From receiving to ICU storage. All 12 units accounted for. These 6 don't have a movement trail. He straightens. His shadow falls across the screen. When he speaks, his voice sounds like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, controlled, dangerous in its absolute calm. You're suggesting that I'm billing for equipment that doesn't exist. I'm saying the numbers don't match. That's all. She turns to face him, but she keeps her posture small. Defensive. Everything about her body language screams subordinate. Apologetic. I'm sure there's an explanation. Could be a logging error in receiving. I just need to flag it for. For what, exactly? For you to raise questions about hospital protocols with the administration? For you to suggest that a physician is engaged in insurance fraud. His voice hasn't changed volume or tone, but the words land like surgical strikes. Precise. Calibrated. Designed to hurt exactly the right amount. Do you understand what you're actually accusing me of? I'm not accusing anyone. I'm asking about the inventory. No. He moves to the door. You're asking about me. And that shows a troubling lack of judgment, frankly. A nurse who works supply audits, not clinical decisions. His hand touches the door handle. This conversation stays between us. You don't mention this discrepancy to anyone. Not administration, not your charge nurse, not anyone. Are we clear? She nods. Doesn't speak. Her silence is her agreement, and they both know it. He leaves. The door closes behind him. She sits alone in the basement with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the phantom weight of 6 missing ventilators. The next morning, Brooke works the day shift. ICU rounds. Medication checks. For maintenance. Everything smooth and invisible. She passes Marcus Chen in the hallway outside room 404. He's a combat medic, 26 years old, tattoo of a crossed rifle and bayonet on his forearm, the kind of bearing that comes from having already seen the worst the world can offer. He's been working with Garrett for 3 days, helping the blind ranger adjust to mobility around the hospital room. When Brooke passes, Marcus stops walking. She doesn't notice at first. Doesn't register that his turn to watch her. But when she steps into room 404 to check Garrett's central line, a delicate thing, 14-gauge angiocath, positioned at the right internal jugular vein, Marcus follows. Just stands in the doorway and watches her work. She inserts the line with a 3-point technique. Anatomical landmarks, ultrasound guidance, smooth advancement. A technique taught only at Fort Bragg's combat trauma training course, embedded into the nervous system of Special Forces field surgeons across 15 years and 3 combat deployments. Her hands remember what her mind has spent 3 years trying to forget. The line goes in clean. Perfect. No deviation. No hesitation. The hiss of air escaping the catheter sheath. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. 112 beats per minute. Stable. Marcus Chen is still watching. His eyes are very alert. She finishes her check and turns to find him standing there with something unreadable on his face. She's seen that expression before. On operators in the dark. On medics in field hospitals who've just realized the person standing next to them isn't who they claim to be. His voice is very quiet when he speaks. She stops. Doesn't turn around. Waits. The moment stretches between them like a held breath. That 3-point technique. The way you angled the needle through the fascia. He doesn't come closer. Doesn't raise his voice. I've only ever seen that done by people with formal Bragg training. Brooke keeps her hand on Garrett's shoulder. Steady. Still. She doesn't answer him. Doesn't turn around. After a long moment, she releases Garrett and walks past Marcus into the hallway. Her pace is normal. Her breathing is normal. Everything about her exterior screams civilian nurse finishing a routine shift. But inside, something sealed has cracked open. Someone has seen something they shouldn't have. And in the basement, 6 missing ventilators are waiting to become much bigger problems than anyone understands yet. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator wheeze and the monotonous beep of the cardiac monitor. The amphitheater at Seattle General fills with 40 residents by 7:51 a.m., their white coats bright as fresh snow under the surgical lights. Dr. Mercer stands at the podium in his tailored charcoal suit, the kind that costs more than most nurses make in a month, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he shuffles papers with deliberate slowness. Brooke enters from the back and positions herself against the wall where she won't be seen, where visibility means nothing, where she can watch without being watched. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical rhythm overhead. Today we discuss documentation standards, Mercer announces, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who's learned to weaponize politeness. Or rather, the absence of them. He clicks the remote. Brooke's charting appears on the projection screen behind him, enlarged to 20 times its original size, her handwriting blown up so large that every rushed letter becomes an indictment. A section is circled in red marker. Then another. Then another, each one a small public execution. This nurse, Mercer continues, not looking at her but making sure everyone else knows exactly where to look, documented a central line insertion in precisely 43 words. 43. For a procedure that requires meticulous detail. He taps the screen with his laser pointer, the red dot hovering over her entry like a sniper's target. Placement depth. Tip location. Suture technique. All absent. All dangerously inadequate. The residents shift. Someone coughs. Brooke's jaw tightens but her face remains a study in neutral observation, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands hang at her sides, steady. Not trembling. Never trembling. When we accept mediocrity, Mercer says, turning to face the room now, his eye sweeping across the assembled residents like a general surveying his troops, we endanger lives. This is not a nursing school. This is a level 1 trauma center. We have standards. He clicks through 7 more pages of her charting, each one a small humiliation carefully catalogued and projected for the educational benefit of people who've never saved a life in a sandstorm with mortars landing 50 yards out. Brooke watches his performance with the expression of someone observing a child throw a tantrum in a grocery store, present, unmoved, waiting for it to finish. When Grand Rounds ends at 8:33 a.m., the residents file out in clusters, their conversations already moving to other topics, but the damage is precisely calculated to linger. Mercer has built his career on understanding human nature, on knowing that public shame doesn't fade when the audience leaves, it multiplies, echoes, becomes folklore. At lunch, Brooke stands at the vending machine in the break room, feeding dollar bills into the slot. The machine whirs and releases a Diet Coke with a mechanical hiss. She's reaching for it when Mercer appears, flanked by 2 other doctors and a visiting cardiologist, moving through the break room like a naval escort through hostile waters. His timing is too perfect to be accident. He's been waiting. Sullivan, he calls out, his voice pitched loud enough that everyone in a 10-foot radius turns to look. Remind me. Did you actually finish nursing school, or did you buy your credentials online? The other doctors laugh on cue, the kind of laughter that's less about humor and more about tribal affiliation, about being on the side of power rather than against it. The visiting cardiologist smiles uncertainly, not yet sure if this is acceptable cruelty or something he should worry about reporting. Brooke stands motionless, one hand holding the Diet Coke, the other at her side. She doesn't speak. Doesn't move. Her eyes meet his eyes with the flat, arctic stare of someone who's interrogated insurgents and lived through ambushes, who understands that speech is optional when silence carries more weight. She lets the moment stretch until his smile begins to waver, until the other doctors sense the shift in pressure, the way the air in the room changes when apex predators enter. The silence lasts exactly 4 seconds. "The only thing inadequate here," Brooke says, and her voice is different now, lower. The kind of voice that emerges when someone stops playing a role and starts being themselves, is a man who needs an audience to feel powerful. She turns and walks away, her scrubs moving smoothly, her pace measured and unhurried. Not running. Not retreating. Walking as if she's just made a routine observation about the weather. She doesn't look back at Mercer as he stands frozen, his face transforming from his usual practiced composure to something red and trembling, his mouth opening and closing like he's searching for language that doesn't exist. The break room goes dead silent except for the vending machine's soft mechanical hum. The visiting cardiologist's smile has disappeared entirely. One of the younger residents looks down at his sandwich with sudden intense focus. What was supposed to be a moment of dominance has become something else, something that tastes like having your authority questioned in front of witnesses, and Mercer's hands clench into fists at his sides, his breathing audible through his nose. 2 hours later, Brooke is organizing medication in the pharmacy when Mercer finds her again, this time without an audience, this time with the desperation of a man whose preferred tools have stopped working. He corners her against the shelving, his finger jabbing toward her face like a weapon, his voice low and urgent and terrified in a way that only wounded pride can create. "You don't speak to me that way," he says, and the tremor in his voice would be pathetic if it wasn't so dangerous. "You're nothing here. Nothing. I can have security escort you out of this hospital in 5 minutes. You understand me? 5 minutes and you're finished." Brooke looks at his finger, then at his face. She doesn't blink. Doesn't step back. Her posture doesn't change, her expression doesn't shift, and what Mercer sees in her eyes, or doesn't see, because there's nothing there but a kind of infinite patience, seems to terrify him more than any words could. She's not angry. She's not defensive. She's simply looking at him the way someone might look at an insect trying to make itself seem larger. "The only thing inadequate here is a man who needs an audience to feel powerful," she says, not because she hasn't already said it, but because now she's saying it without an audience, and that changes everything about its meaning. She turns and walks toward the nurse's station, leaving him standing alone in the pharmacy corridor with his raised finger and his trembling jaw and the awful realization that he has no power over someone who has literally nothing left to lose. The fluorescent lights flicker above him like dying stars. That night, at 11:41 p.m., Marcus Chen finds her at the nursing station updating charts for his patient in 404. The blind veteran named Garrett, the former ranger who lost his sight to an IED outside Kandahar, the one whose condition has been stable since she checked his central line placement that morning using the 3-point technique. Marcus is a combat medic, which means he's seen what rail medicine looks like under fire, which means he knows the difference between a technique taught in nursing schools and a technique taught at Fort Bragg to people who operate in places where mistakes mean body bags. He says quietly, pulling her aside where Mercer can't hear, "I saw how you inserted that central line in 404 today. The depth measurement. The way you verified placement. The 3-point stabilization technique." He pauses. "They only teach that at Fort Bragg. It's not a question. It's recognition. It's a code word spoken by someone who understands what the code word means." Brooke meets his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough for Marcus to see that he's correct, long enough for him to understand that she understands that he understands, and then she walks away without answering. The chart she was updating stays on the desk. Her footsteps disappear down the corridor toward the stairwell. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:06 a.m., the code blue alarm screams from 404. The code blue alarm screamed at 2:06 a.m. Not the standard electronic beep, the full resuscitation shriek that turned the 4th-floor corridor into a combat zone without a single gunshot fired. Brooke was restocking the crash cart when it happened, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check the assignment board. Her body was already moving toward 404 before her brain caught up, muscle memory pulling her down the hallway like a rope tied around her sternum. Room 404 was chaos. Controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Garrett, the blind veteran whose scarred face had begun to recognize voices in the darkness, lay convulsing on the bed, his body rigid as concrete, his chest collapsing inward with each desperate breath that wouldn't come. The oxygen saturation monitor screamed its own alarm, the red numbers plummeting like a stone dropped down a well: 89, 84, 78, 72. 3 residents stood frozen in a triangle formation around the bed, their mouths open, their hands hovering over equipment they didn't know how to use. One had a bag valve mask pressed against Garrett's face at the wrong angle. Another was fumbling with an intubation kit, his fingers trembling visibly. The third was checking the monitor again, as if different numbers might appear if he looked harder. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung from the inside out, pressing against the heart. Brooke didn't need to touch him to know. She could see it in the way his ribs pulled inward, the way his body was trying to breathe against an impossible weight. This was the kill stroke, the one they'd watched happen to 3 soldiers in Kandahar when the blast fragmentation missed their plates by an inch. Survivable if treated in the next 90 seconds. Fatal if it wasn't. "Step back," she said, her voice dropping 2 octaves in an instant. Not a question. Not a request. A command that came from somewhere bone deep and military sharp. The residents scattered like startled birds. One of them opened his mouth to protest. She was a nurse, and there was a protocol, and a doctor should be called, but something in her eyes made him swallow the words. She moved toward the crash cart without running. Running was panic. Walking with purpose was clarity. She grabbed the 18-gauge needle, the largest bore they had in the room, her hands moving on their own now. No hesitation. No second guessing. This was muscle memory layered over muscle memory, a technique drilled into her nervous system during a field medicine course at Fort Bragg 13 years ago, practiced on mannequins filled with saline solution, then perfected on actual human chests while mortar rounds landed 50 yards out and the wind carried the smell of diesel and blood. "Oxygen, now," she said to the resident with the bag valve mask. "Keep his head elevated. 30 degrees. She located the second intercostal space, the space between Garrett's second and third ribs, mid-clavicular line. Her finger found the landmarks with the precision of a weapon system. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. There was resistance, the parietal pleura, tough as old boot leather, and then a sudden give, a slight resistance, and then a sound that changed everything. The hiss of air escaping. Pressurized air that had been slowly strangling Garrett's lungs, pouring out like a tire deflating. The decompression was instant. Garrett's body went limp, his rigid convulsion stopping as if someone had switched off a current. His oxygen saturation monitor climbed, 72, 76, 81, 87, 92. The rhythm of the climb was like watching a man surface from drowning, each percentage point a gulp of air. Brooke's hands were steady. That was what separated the trained from the terrified, hands that didn't shake, hands that knew the next move before the crisis demanded it. She didn't think about protocol or liability or the fact that a nurse performing a needle decompression was technically operating outside her scope of practice in every hospital in the continental United States. She thought about Garrett's scar tissue, still fresh and angry from the IED blast. She thought about the way his hands had trembled when she'd first checked his vitals, before the fear had worn him smooth. She thought about the unit patch on the folded flag she'd placed on his nightstand, the patch that matched the scar pattern on his face, that told her story he didn't know she could read. "Get a chest X-ray," she said to no one in particular. The resident with the trembling hands was already on the phone. Good. The second resident was documenting vitals. Better. The third was just staring at her, at the 18-gauge needle still protruding from Garrett's chest, at the blood on her scrubs that was no longer theoretical. Her scrubs had been white 10 seconds ago. Now they looked like she'd been painted with his survival. O2 sats climbing, the documentation resident reported. His voice had shifted, the panic leaching out. 92%. 94, heart rates dropping, was 142, now down to 118. Brooke stepped back from the bed, her hand still raised slightly, the way surgeons held their hands in post-op photos. In the overhead light, she could see the blood on her gloves, the spray pattern on her scrubs, the way her sleeve had gotten wet somewhere between the crash cart and the decompression. Normal. All of it normal for emergency thoracic intervention. She'd been dirtier than this in sandstorms with better excuses. At least here there was antiseptic and fluorescent light instead of flies and mortar fire. Good work, one of the residents whispered, but she was already turning toward the door. The crisis had crested. The immediate threat had been neutralized. The next move was observation, monitoring, and preparation for whatever came next. She needed to find the attending physician and report what had happened before someone else did. She needed to strip off these scrubs and dump them in biohazard. She needed to wash the blood from under her fingernails, the way she'd learned to do in a field hospital outside Kandahar where water was precious and infections were often fatal. But she made it exactly 3 steps before the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened and Dr. Mercer emerged, already moving toward the code blue alert that had just been called clear. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes tracked from her face to her blood-soaked scrubs to the open door of 404, where 2 residents were now discussing which imaging protocol to use. His jaw tightened. His smile, that practiced smile he'd been wearing all week, faltered and died on his face like a fish pulled from water. "Dr. Mercer," one of the residents called out. "Code's been resolved. The patient's stable." Dr. Mercer didn't respond. He was still looking at Brooke, his eyes moving over her like she was a problem he'd just discovered and didn't have a solution for. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular frequency that made you crazy after too many night shifts. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed, closing in on the emergency bay downstairs, bringing another crisis, another patient, another chance for someone to be wrong about who they were standing next to. "What?" Dr. Mercer said very slowly, "exactly happened here?" Dr. Mercer stood motionless in the ICU doorway, his eyes moving from Garrett's chest, rising and falling with steady rhythm, to Brooke's blood-soaked hands. The monitors beeped their reassuring pattern. Sinus rhythm. Oxygen saturation climbing. The numbers that spelled survival. "Well," he said. Brooke didn't turn. She was already moving to the sink, letting the water run hot while she peeled off her gloves. The blood swirled down the drain in thin pink streams. Behind her, she could hear the overnight nurses frozen in place, their eyes locked on her face, on the precision of her movements, on the fact that she'd just done something 3 residents couldn't. Something that required training they didn't have. Dr. Mercer's question hung unanswered. He asked it again, his voice dropping into that particular register she'd learned to recognize, the sound of a man whose authority had just been publicly unmade. "I said, what exactly happened here?" Brooke turned off the water. Dried her hands with paper towels. Counted to 3. Her reflection in the stainless steel was steady. Composed. A woman wearing blood like battle paint. "Tension pneumothorax," she said quietly. Needle decompression wasn't sufficient. The patient required surgical intervention. Without consulting me. Without waiting for. The patient was in cardiac arrest. The words landed like stones. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. He looked at the 3 residents, still paralyzed at the monitor station, and his expression shifted. Calculating. The anger was still there, she could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, but underneath it was something sharper. Strategic. "I see," he said finally. "We'll discuss this in my office at 0600. It was not a request. It was the voice of a man who understood he'd lost the moment, so he was preparing to win the war. Brooke didn't nod. She simply resumed her work, checking Garrett's lines, confirming his vitals, making notes on the chart with the same precise handwriting that had earned her a written reprimand earlier in the week. Around her, the night shift nurses slowly resumed their duties, but something had changed in the room. The fluorescent panels hummed their endless song, and underneath it she could hear the whisper of respect that had nothing to do with her uniform. Marcus Chen approached as she was leaving Garrett's room. His eyes were wet. he said. Just that. But she heard what he didn't say. She heard Kandahar. She heard the 3 tours. She heard the fact that he'd recognized something in her hands that the doctors had missed, the kind of training that came from operating in sandstorms with mortars landing 50 yards out. Get some rest, Brooke told him. She didn't sleep. The code had burned through her adrenaline, and she spent the remaining hours before 0600 in the break room, watching the clock, knowing what was coming. Knowing the shape of it, even if not the exact form. You didn't perform an emergency thoracotomy in a civilian hospital without authorization and walk away unscathed. The rules existed for reasons. Liability. Credentialing. The careful paper trails that protected institutions. Dr. Mercer was waiting in his office when she arrived. He was already in his white coat, already radiating the careful regret of a man about to do something he wanted the world to understand was unfortunate but necessary. His office was all leather furniture and diplomas, the walls a careful construction of status. Sit, he said. She stood instead. His eyes narrowed. I've spent the last 3 hours reviewing the incident report from tonight's code. He held up a folder. I've made some corrections. The attending physician, myself, was not notified of the patient's deterioration until after you'd already taken an authorized action. The surgical procedure was performed without consultation, without proper authorization, and without regard for hospital protocol. That's not what happened. That's what will be in the official record. His voice was smooth. Matter of fact. The voice of a man who'd learned how to reshape reality through paperwork. I've also restricted your access to patient floors pending a disciplinary hearing. You'll report to HR at 0800 for the termination meeting. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay. The words landed. She let them land. Somewhere in the hospital, a patient was waking up. Somewhere, a family was being told their loved one had survived the night. Those things were real. Everything else was noise. Dr. Chen witnessed what happened, she said quietly. Petty Officer Chen is military medical personnel. His observations will be noted. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man who understood that she had no leverage, no witnesses who mattered in civilian court, no authority to contradict his version of events. The hospital's legal team will be sending you a letter regarding your severance and your NDA. I suggest you read it very carefully. The confidentiality clause is quite comprehensive. She understood then. He wasn't just firing her. He was burying her. He was building walls around what had happened, sealing it into silence the way Operation Sandpiper had sealed her into silence 3 years ago. Different chains. Same cage. At 0600, the morning shift was arriving. Nurses shuffling in with their coffee, their tired eyes, their routine. Dr. Mercer walked with her to the nursing station. His hand was on her elbow, not forcefully, but present. Performative. By the time they reached the desk, 2 security guards were already waiting. Effective immediately, Dr. Mercer announced to the gathered staff, Nurse Sullivan's employment with Seattle General is terminated. She'll be collecting her personal belongings under escort. She could feel the eyes on her. The shock. The confusion. Some of these nurses had worked with her for 3 years. They didn't know her name. They didn't know where she'd come from. All they knew was that she never complained, never called in sick, and could manage any patient without breaking a sweat. I'm sorry it's come to this, Dr. Mercer continued, his voice thick with manufactured regret. Unfortunately, we have strict protocols regarding patient care and liability. I'm sure you all understand that these policies exist to protect our patients and our institution. Nobody moved. Nobody asked questions. That was how power worked in places like this, quietly, through the careful manipulation of procedure, through the understanding that there were official channels and unofficial truths, and the official channels were always more credible. Brooke removed her ID badge. It had her photo from 3 years ago, her hair shorter then, her eyes harder. She placed it on the desk. The sound of the plastic hitting the laminate was very small. A janitor somewhere was mopping a floor. A patient somewhere was calling for help. The hospital moved on without her. The security guards escorted her to the locker room. She gathered her things, a change of clothes, a photo of a lake she'd never visited, a challenge coin from someone she wasn't supposed to remember. The guards waited while she closed the locker door. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet space. The basement laundry room was 3 floors down. That's where she went. Not because she needed to, but because it felt honest somehow, a last station before disappearing. The fluorescent panels down here were older, dimmer, casting everything in the pale light of a place the hospital didn't bother to maintain. Bins of soiled linen sat in the corner. Clean scrubs folded in neat stacks on the sorting table. She pulled out her work scrubs from the locker, the blue one she'd worn for 1,247 shifts, not that she'd counted. She began to fold them. Left side to center. Right side to center. Bottom up to create a rectangle. Each crease precise and military sharp, the fabric heavy in her hands. 3 years of 12-hour shifts condensed into a stack of folded blue cloth. A janitor was mopping the far corner. Middle-aged, dark hair, the kind of man who'd learned long ago not to ask questions about things that happened in hospitals. He watched her fold without speaking. But she could feel his eyes on her, could read the pity there, the recognition that something wrong was happening to someone who didn't deserve it. She folded the last pair and placed them in the return bin. The symbol of surrender. The last visible thing connecting her to Seattle General Hospital, Norfolk, Virginia. "You did good work," the janitor said quietly. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the loading dock. The morning air hit her face as she pushed through the door, cool, edged with the salt smell of the harbor. Behind her, the hospital stood enormous and indifferent, already moving on to the next crisis, the next code, the next patient who needed saving. She was halfway to her car when her phone lit up. Then again. And again. Messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Unknown callers. The notifications came so fast she couldn't read them all, something about the news, something about calling, something urgent. She got to her apartment and stood in the quiet of her small living room, her hands shaking for the first time since the code. Not from fear. From restraint. 3 years of staying invisible. 3 years of the instruction, never exist again. And in one night, in one moment of muscle memory and training and the reflex to save a life, she'd exposed everything. Her phone rang. An actual call, not a text. A number with a 202 area code. Washington, D.C. She let it ring 4 times before answering. Captain Sullivan. The voice was male, military cadence, the particular tone of someone used to giving orders. "My name is Colonel Holloway. I believe you have something we need to discuss. Something about Operation Sandpiper." Brooke closed her eyes. Outside her window, the city was waking up. Somewhere in the hospital, Garrett was opening his eyes. Somewhere, Dr. Mercer was probably already calling his lawyers, consolidating his version of events, building his defense. "I'm listening," she said. 7 black SUVs rolled into Seattle General's parking lot at 7:16 a.m., and the rain that had been hammering the pavement all night suddenly seemed to hold its breath. Operators in dress uniforms began stepping out, 2 dozen of them, moving with the synchronized precision of men who'd trained together in sand and darkness. Their dress blues were crisp as knife blades. Their medals caught the gray morning light. A Navy Master Chief stood at the front, his presence making the air pressure change, and behind him came a Marine colonel whose shoulders carried the weight of authority like a second skeleton. The hospital staff noticed first. A resident froze mid-sip of coffee in the break room, watching through the glass doors as the formation assembled. Security called upstairs. By the time the operators moved through the sliding entrance, word had already started spreading. There's military personnel, serious military personnel, moving toward the elevators with purpose. Brooke was at home, sitting on her kitchen floor in the dark with her first aid kit open, when her phone exploded. Text after text from nurses she'd worked with for 3 years. Asterisk turn on the news. Asterisk asterisk check channel 7. Asterisk asterisk oh my god Brooke. Asterisk she didn't move at first. She sat there in the darkness, staring at the ceramic tile she'd been meaning to grout for 6 months, and then she turned on the television. The news anchor was already mid-sentence. Unprecedented show of force at Seattle General this morning as the U.S. military arrived en masse for what sources are calling a medal ceremony. The military has not commented on the nature of the visit, but witnesses report Special Forces personnel and at least one 3-star general. Brooke was in her car 12 minutes later. Traffic on I-64 moved like scar tissue healing, slow, jagged, refusing to flow smoothly. She didn't think about what was happening. She'd learned to shut down her mind during crisis. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with the muscle memory of 1,000 night runs, and her foot kept the accelerator steady at exactly 71 miles per hour. Room for Ofer was chaos wrapped in military discipline. Garrett sat propped up in bed, and his face, the scarred landscape where the IED blast had stolen his sight, was turned toward the doorway, tracking sounds with the uncanny precision of a man who'd learned to navigate a dark world. His hands clutched something folded. White fabric. Red stripe. Blue field. The flag. The flag she'd placed on his nightstand 3 days ago when she thought she'd never see him again. When Brooke stepped through the door, the room seemed to reorganize itself around her presence. Officers straightened. A chaplain stepped back. The blind veteran's head tilted, following her footsteps, and then his scarred face turned in her direction with the accuracy of a radar lock. Reaper, he whispered. Not a question. A recognition. A name that belonged to him alone now, the call sign she'd thought was buried under 3 years of civilian identity, and hearing it spoken aloud in this hospital room felt like stepping into a photograph of herself from another life. The Marine colonel stepped forward. His uniform was decorated with the kind of medals that required permission slips to wear. His voice had the timbre of command, and when he began speaking, it was with the precision of words read from official documentation. Captain Brooke Sullivan, for extraordinary valor during Operation Sandpiper, when she performed a 4-hour field surgery under enemy fire and saved 11 operators. The room went exactly as quiet as Brooke had ever heard it. Monitor beeping. Ventilator wheeze. Rain against the window. Everything else erased by the weight of those words. Asterisk Captain. Operation Sandpiper. 11 operators. Asterisk. Dr. Mercer shouldered through the crowd after the third sentence. His face was already flushed. His jaw worked like something mechanical, clicking and releasing. Now hold on, he said, pushing past a general's aide. Hold on. We need to establish protocol here. I need to see credentials. This is a hospital, not a military installation. I need credentials and I need authorization from hospital administration. His voice kept rising, kept pushing, kept demanding acknowledgement like a dog barking at a fence. Brooke didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward, her shoulders level, her breathing exactly calibrated, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the kind of breathing they'd taught her in Kandahar when mortars were landing close enough to taste copper. 2 FBI agents appeared at Dr. Mercer's elbows as if they'd been summoned by some invisible protocol. They weren't in tactical gear. They wore suits the color of expensive asphalt, and their badges hung from their necks like medals of their own. One was a woman with a face that looked like it hadn't smiled since Obama's second term. The other was a man with the build of someone who'd played linebacker before trading the field for the federal system. Dr. James Mercer, the woman asked. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone holding an arrest warrant like a knife in a sheath. Mercer's face went from flushed to something approaching white. What are you? Our investigation into healthcare fraud at this facility has expanded, the man said. His voice was the opposite of raised. It was quiet. Controlled. The kind of voice that made people listen harder. Financial records. Equipment billing. Phantom ventilator charges totaling $2.3 million over 3 years. But that's not, Mercer started. It gets worse, the woman continued. We found someone attempted to forge disciplinary records for a nurse whose personnel file contains classified security gaps. That triggered automatic federal flags. That made this our case now. Brooke watched him as they said it. She watched his hands go slack at his sides. She watched the way his mouth opened without sound coming out, like a fish on a dock, gasping for an ocean he'd never reach again. This was what desperation looked like when you'd finally run out of power. This was the moment when all those calls to allies, all those stacked committees and manipulated protocols, all those years of moving through the world like a predator, all of it evaporated. The two agents walked him out past the cameras. His hands were in handcuffs, steel against his wrists, and his head hung like a man who was finally understanding the true weight of consequence. The news helicopters captured it all, Dr. James Mercer being escorted through the rain by federal agents, his career folding like wet paper, his freedom about to become a legal question with years of appeals and lost motions. Then a three-star general stepped forward. His dress uniform was decorated with ribbons that told the story of 4 decades of service, 3 deployments, 2 commands, 1 legend. He raised his hand in salute, not at Brooke exactly, but in the direction of the Navy cross pinned to her civilian jacket. The medal caught the fluorescent light like a fragment of something sacred. Mercer's voice followed them from the hallway, still protesting, still demanding, still convinced that the world operated according to rules he understood. But the rules had changed. The rules had always been different than he'd imagined. He'd just never had access to the real ones. 6 months passed in a blur of paperwork and federal procedures. Brooke's Pentagon office overlooked the Potomac, and from her window she could see the rain falling on water that didn't care how it fell. She wore her uniform now, not the civilian scrubs, but the dress blues that fit like a second skin she'd forgotten she was wearing. 3 gold oak leaves on her collar. Captain's insignia on her sleeve. All the years of invisibility finally acknowledged in buttons and fabric. Mercer moved boxes into a medical supply van in the parking lot of a clinic 2,400 miles away in Juneau, Alaska. His sentence was 12 years federal prison, forfeiture of license, and 3 years of community service to work off the restitution, about $847,000 that he'd never actually repay. The court had learned efficiency from dealing with him. The marshal watching from the curb had learned patience. She could see it in the news footage that circulated through Pentagon channels, the way he moved slowly now, the reflective vest reading community service in block letters that couldn't be ignored or explained away. His shoulders had collapsed inward like a building after demolition. His hands moved like they belonged to someone else. Brooke felt nothing watching him. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Not revenge, that was a luxury for people who still had the capacity for rage. She'd used up her rage in Kandahar. All that was left now was the cold arithmetic of justice. You burned the rule follower. You demolished the corruption. You let the system do what systems did when they actually functioned, you destroyed the predator. Garrett arrived at her office on a Tuesday afternoon, his service dog leading him through the Pentagon security checkpoints with the confidence of someone who'd already learned the corridors by sound and memory. When he reached her door, he held out the folded flag. The one with the unit colors. The one she'd placed on his nightstand the morning after she saved his life and before she was fired. I think you should have this back, It belongs with the person who earned it. Brooke took the flag and placed it on her desk beside her Navy cross. Her hands, steady as they'd always been, didn't tremble. Outside her window, a formation of new recruits marched past, veterans like her, given second chances, their classified pasts no longer chains but foundations. 300 personnel in 6 months. The program was growing. Marcus Chen was among them now, promoted to training officer, his recognition of her surgical technique the thread that had started unraveling her anonymity. Permission to ask you something, Captain. Garrett's voice pulled her back to the present moment. She turned from the window. Go ahead. How did you stay so calm when Mercer was tearing you apart in front of everyone? How did you not, I don't know. Fight back. Yell. Something. Brooke looked at the folded flag on her desk. Then she looked at this man who'd lost his eyes to an IED and found his way through darkness anyway. "I learned something in Kandahar," she said carefully. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest. The quietest person in the room might just be holding it all together. Garrett smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that came from someone reconstructing happiness one muscle at a time. Reaper, indeed. Below them, the medical supply van pulled away from the clinic parking lot, heading toward whatever life awaited a man who'd traded power for consequences. It moved down the road like any other vehicle, unremarkable, forgettable, exactly the thing he'd become. If you've ever watched someone expose themselves as a fraud, someone we all trust on credentials they manipulated, comment below and tell me what it took for you to stop respecting them. And please, subscribe and hit that notification bell because next week we're bringing you a story about the prosecutor who dismantled a billion-dollar trafficking ring and then disappeared into witness protection. You don't want to miss it.